Hello, office hours are supposed to start in a couple of minutes, and hopefully this is actually working this time. Okay, I think we've actually gotten it up and running. I'm going to wait just a sec while I check a second computer so I can be sure it has not gone haywire on me. Okay, it looks like we're doing all right. I realize this seems a little dramatic, but I ended up with a complicated setup involving two computers and a separate microphone. So I was fully expecting that they were all going to get in an argument at the last minute. So welcome to office hours. It's nice to proverbially see you all. I'm Bobby. That makes me the head TA, and I'm a PhD student at Georgia Tech who graduated out of the OMS program. Officially graduated in August, actually. So just about a month ago, and maybe a month and a couple of days. And this is the second to last office hours before the first exam. So one of the things I want to remind you to take really seriously is getting ready to use ProctorTrack. If you have never used it before, you should definitely try out the practice exam that's set up. Using ProctorTrack is generally not that difficult. The software usability is pretty reasonable, but sometimes people do run into problems with some kind of unusual software setup. Sometimes people do realize that they're using a work laptop and they can't run this software because it's monitoring software. Sometimes people just find that something inexplicably goes wrong and they have to scramble at the last minute. And that is not something you want to be doing on, say, Sunday night of the actual exam period. You want to have your whole mind focused on the actual material and not fighting with the proctoring software. Let's see. Make sure that you familiarize yourself with the directions that Dr. Pryby gave when it comes to how you should type in the passwords. When you start up ProctorTrack, it will give you CS6505 plus a short 4-number code that you use to actually log into the exam. And every single time we give an exam, someone panics because they try to log into they either try to log into T-Square using that code when you're supposed to log into T-Square with your credentials, or they try to use their Georgia Tech credentials to log into the exam. Either one of those things will cause you to not be able to get to the exam. So you have to make sure that you're doing the thing that the instructions say. I believe that the practice exam has been set up so that you can take it repeatedly. So even if you're not quite ready to sit and try to take it for real, you can kind of just give the software a try and ignore the questions, and then go back later and give it another try when you're ready to actually do the questions for real. Along the same line, make sure that you practice your scanning ahead of time. You don't want to be realizing while you're in the exam that you have no idea how to scan multiple pages at once. That is a thing that's happened. We've had people make us 20 individual files because they didn't realize that for their scanning software, they had no idea how to make it scan multiple pages all into the same file. This is all stuff that you would ideally want to not be stressing about. And if anyone has any medical conditions at all that would give you a problem with taking the exam or require any kind of special accommodations, please, please, please tell us in advance. Online students are completely entitled to all of the same protections with the American Disabilities Act and that kind of thing that any other student is. And the worst thing is when someone tells me after the semester is completely over and I'm talking to them weeks later and they say, "Oh, yeah, I really wish I'd had more time on that exam. I have, some medical condition or other that makes it really hard to deal with the timeline and to get done in time." And that's just painful because if you have a real issue, you're entitled to more time to help you compensate for that. But if we don't know until later, there's very little we can do. So please tell us. And likewise, if you have a condition that requires some kind of equipment to be with you, please tell us that too. We've had students, for example, who have diabetes, and we're worried that we were going to tell them that they couldn't have their blood sugar monitor handy. We are never going to tell you that a diabetic is not allowed to check their blood sugar and must sit there and go into hypoglycemia and pass out. You are absolutely allowed to take care of yourself. You just have to warn us in advance so that we can figure out the right way to make things work. Okay, so that's all our logistics stuff. And hopefully everyone is feeling, at least a little more reassured that we care, that you're okay. um, I understand completely there are 300 people in these classes, and obviously it's not easy for us to check up on every one of you individually all the time. So yeah, we can't do that much. But if there is something you need and it's a reasonable request, then we're trying. And we certainly don't want anything bad to happen to you. We don't want you to fail. We're doing our best to help you out here. So moving on to actual class material, because that's what you're all here for. One of the things people have pointed out is that at the beginning of the video Chris released, he said he was going to release a supplemental video that talks about a few things. And let's see, to keep us oriented, he was going to talk about random variables, and expected value, and the concept of independence. And if anyone has a lot of background in probability or has actually taken the artificial intelligence course, you probably have some familiarity with all of these things, and they're exactly the things that you think they are. Random variables are essentially values where you don't know in advance what they're going to be. When we do the math, we assume that everything is truly random. When an actual computer program runs, it's going to be pseudo-random, which means that it comes out of a random number generator. And if you were to start the random number generator with the same seed, then you would get the same values, and the values would be predictable. But for mathematical purposes, we completely ignore that, and we assume that we're getting actual random values. So, for example, if you're getting a random binary string, and it's a string of ones and zeros, then every single individual digit can be equally likely to be either a 1 or a 0. And nothing that you've seen in the string so far tells you anything about what the next digit is going to be. Now for expected value, that's, I think it's more intuitive to think of expected value along the lines of, say, investing or gambling. It's when you figure out how much you're probably going to have at the end of some kind of move, but it doesn't have to be an actual value that can happen. So let me see how to explain that. If we were making a bet and you could either end up with $0 or $1, and they were equally likely, you would do the math on this for expected value by saying there's a 1/2 chance that you end up with nothing and a 1/2 chance that you end up with 1. And so the total is 0.5. Now, the important thing to note here is that 0.5 is not a value that's actually possible in this arrangement, but it is the expected value. And yes, we are recording. It actually, the one really good feature we should be getting for using YouTube Live is that this is live streaming, and YouTube is supposed to be responsible for automatically loading it onto the YouTube site, wherever. It'll, I guess, be in my playlist. If people can't get back to the video easily later, I'll make sure that I repost a link to whatever the final link for that session ends up being. I realize it sounds like I'm hopelessly confused about how this works, and that's because this is true. YouTube Live is a replacement for Hangouts on Air. Just about every class has used Hangouts on Air for the past 2 or 3 years to do office hours, and Google is phasing it out as of, I think, October. So everyone is scrambling to switch over, and none of us quite knows how any of it works. So if you have other classes that are similarly confused, be generous with them and don't assume that it's bizarre that they have been doing this for several years and they have no idea what's going on. So back to expected value. I was saying intuitively, I think the concept makes more sense when you're thinking about gambling or investing, because it's easier to think about how much you would expect to have after you try this maybe 1,000 times or 10,000 times or 100,000 times. This is the value that you would approach over time, most likely, as the sort of steady state if you were to keep doing this over and over again. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a value that can happen in any single attempt. Moving on to independence, the sort of formal way of expressing independence is, and I'm talking about probability here, the probability space for A intersection B is the same as the probability for A multiplied by the probability for B. In the previous versions of the class, we've spent some time at the beginning going over this kind of stuff. That's intersection. That means the probability that both of these things turn out to be true at the same time. If you don't know set notation, you will eventually need to learn it, but I don't think it's been a very big deal so far, so you probably don't need to panic about it for the first exam. But by the time we're reaching Turing machines and countability and that kind of stuff, you will definitely have to get this down. Anyway, the idea behind independence is that you're talking about the probability of things that don't affect one another. If I were to flip 2 coins, the result of one coin has nothing to do with what the other coin does. And so if I were to flip 2 coins at the same time and hide the results, and I showed you what had happened with one, I said, oh, look, the first coin is heads. That doesn't tell you anything that makes you better able to guess at what the second coin is. And fundamentally, that's just what independence is. I'm sure Chris will go over it at more length. I don't want to completely replicate something that he's probably making with more rigor and a more clear explanation. But I know that some people have been asking about why that video hasn't appeared yet, so I thought I'd touch on it quickly. And if you ever decide to take the artificial intelligence course, you will be learning a lot about independence and conditional independence and conditional dependence and all kinds of fancy probability things that would be meant to help your AI make decisions. But it matters for us, but you don't have to get into all the conditional stuff and the super detailed things. We try to keep it in a space where you're reasoning about something, but not doing it in a way where the math gets explosively complicated, because we want to be focused on how you're able to reason about a problem. We don't want to focus so much on how you're able to execute the actual mathematics, which is why we don't worry about having things like calculators handy. We attempt to avoid getting into that kind of space. So let's get rid of this. And another thing I wanted to touch on was the concept of a minimum cut. The videos in Udacity talk about this, but they kind of talk about it in the sense of saying, oh, you already know what a minimum cut is because we talked about it in MaxFlow. Except this semester, MaxFlow hasn't happened yet. And when the videos were made, they assumed that it had already occurred. So the first thing you need to understand is what a connected graph is. Now, I'll just draw a few little points, and then I'll draw some lines, and now my graph is connected, because from any point in this graph, you can get anywhere else. If I were to not have one of these lines, my graph is not connected. And so the concept of a cut is that you're identifying how many lines you need to remove. Well, a minimum cut is how many of these lines, which we call edges, you would need to remove to cause the graph to no longer be connected. So if you have a graph where there is some point where you can start, but there are other vertices that you would never be able to reach because edges are missing, that is an unconnected graph. And that's what this is talking about. You should probably also know, it may or may not ever come up, I don't know, but the idea of connected graph is not the same thing as a complete graph. A complete graph is one that has every possible edge. Like I said, it may not ever matter, but I do recall previous semesters where these concepts got mixed up. And so I want to proactively point out that this is a thing that can happen. And let's see, what else were we asked to talk about? I believe question 3.5. I have it on here. Yes, problem set 3, number 5. Suppose we have two binary strings of length n, two separate locations. So I'm going to start with intuitively, why the heck would we ever care about this? This is the same kind of problem that everybody faces when they do something like download VirtualBox. When you download VirtualBox, they'll give you both the download and they'll show you what's usually called an MD5 string. Sometimes it's called something else, but that's typical. And what this is an expression of what the file is that's been compressed down to a much, much smaller string. I think it's 128 bits. And so all you have to do on your end is run a function that does the MD5 calculation on the file you've received. And if it produces the same number, you have a pretty high confidence that you have the same file that was sent. Before anyone gets too pedantic about it, MD5 is not considered to be a secure hash. It is possible to deliberately create files that have the same MD5 hash so that you could trick someone into thinking that a file is legitimate that it's not. But the kind of point of this problem is that you're saying, okay, two different people have the same file, and they want to know if they have the same file without actually transmitting it. So what can they do that would allow them to compare their different numbers and figure out whether the contents are the same? There are different ways you can do this. Typically, if you see something in a assignment or on the test that says hint, try it this way, I would strongly suggest trying it that way. Usually the hint provided is specifically chosen because it makes your reasoning follow a line that you've been shown how to do. It is almost always possible, however, to do the problem in other ways. And if you happen to see some other way to do it, you're allowed to do that. When it says hint, you're allowed to do something else. If we were to actually say, solve this by using polynomial identity testing, then you're not allowed to do something else. And I would say I've looked at what people have been discussing on Piazza. The approach there is sane. I don't want to short circuit the discussion by providing an outright answer yet, but the idea that you can treat your strings as if they're polynomials and add the actual variables on is a sane approach. You can get to the answer that way. Okay, I'm addressing a question. A minimum cut is the set of edges that must be removed, or the number of it. Oh, there we go. The minimum cut is the set of edges that must be removed, and it's the smallest set of edges that must be removed to cause the graph to be unconnected. Like, you can always form a cut by putting every edge in the graph into a set. And now the graph has no edges whatsoever. But that's probably not going to be the minimum cut in most graphs. So when you're trying to find the minimum cut, it's much harder. And I should possibly add that some of the material in the class might seem like they didn't fully explain why it matters. The old ordering of the class was that the first thing you would study is what a computer can do and what a computer can't do. So, for example, there's a thing called the halting problem that it's been proven that no computer program can perfectly solve for all possible cases. And then once you've talked about that, you would move into the complexity portion, which is a discussion about, okay, we have a set of problems we know we can solve, but how long is that going to take? And that's related to what you're doing now with algorithm analysis, but it's more focused on the fact that there are certain types of problems where the difficulty of solving them appears to grow so fast as the input increases that for a large problem, you would effectively not be able to solve it anyway. The standard example of a problem that falls into that kind of category is factoring. It's very easy to multiply two numbers, but if you have a very, very large number, it's difficult to identify how it should be factored, particularly the product of two primes. So that's basically what all of cryptography rests on. Anyway, after we would study how long it would take to solve different types of problems, then we would come into the part of the class that's equivalent to what you're doing now. And the algorithms portion of the class has always been kind of like, okay, we know that some types of problems are really hard, or at least we're pretty sure they're really hard. So is there anything super clever we can do to make it easier? And that's kind of where we are right now. When you're talking about randomized algorithms, it can seem weird to say, like, well, we could write a straightforward explanation of how you could do this for real without having to call on any randomness. So why don't we just do that? But often the reason randomized algorithms are used is because they're a way to get you really close to an answer without doing all the calculation that's required to get an actual answer. So something like min cut, for example, finding the actual minimum cut takes more calculation than it takes to just say, okay, I'm going to do some random things and then I'll run that algorithm a bunch of times and take whatever looks like it's the best. And there are a lot of times when you can say, yeah, an answer that's 98% perfect is good enough. I don't actually need the absolute optimum. Uh, all kinds of stuff use that. That kind of if you find yourself loving that kind of problem, you'll probably really enjoy artificial intelligence, because the professor for artificial intelligence, Tad, describes the field as kind of the study of trying to solve these really hard problems that we don't think have solutions, like trying to find ways to approximate an answer that's good enough that you can keep your robot car from driving off the road, even though the perfect answer might take so long that it wouldn't arrive in time that the car could use it to keep driving. So you approximate and you randomize and you figure out where it's safe to cut the corners. And none of what I've just said is really absolutely crucial to doing well in the course, but just in case you found yourself saying, why would we even want to do that? Like, why don't we just do the calculations and get the right answer and be done with it? That kind of thing is the reason. And because of the change in the ordering of the class, I think it's less clear than it used to be that that was the thinking of how the different parts fit together. Those are really all of the big things that we had to talk about. Are there any logistical things or anything like that you want to discuss? Because I don't, there, we already handled a lot of the content-based questions in the Piazza thread because I didn't want to keep you waiting too much while I was having technical problems. Yeah, I think for people with a lot of programming background, coming at it in this direction is probably a little easier. Um, there's a sort of a historical dispute about which part of the class is harder. I've had a lot of people say, oh, the algorithms portion is easier. And then I've had other people, after I told them that, say, oh, don't let anyone tell you that the algorithm part is easier. They're lying. Because they'd be saying, oh yeah, if you're counting on the algorithm part to make the class make sense to you and you're completely lost, then don't assume that. But I really think that there are some people for whom one part makes a lot of sense and the other part is completely obtuse. And then there are other people who experience the class the completely different way. And unfortunately, it's really hard to say which group an individual person is going to be in. So when it comes up around W deadline time, people will be saying, well, do you think I should drop the class? Or do you think I need to take it over again? And it's hard to give a good answer because there is a very real chance that the person you're talking to is going to make a dramatic turnaround in the rest of the material. But there's also a chance that they won't. And so it's difficult to give really solid advice. The exam is slated to have 3 questions, for which there will be 90 minutes total, so approximately 30 minutes a question. You should be able to see your computer clock while you're taking the exam. Uh, on one occasion, while I was taking the exam, because of my screen resolution, like there's this kind of colored bar around the edges of the screen while Proctor Track is running. Some people find that sort of intrusive. I think it's meant, I think it's intended to be ethical, that they want this highly visible thing that makes sure that you realize you're currently being monitored, so that there's no possibility that their software could be monitoring someone who's unaware. But anyway, there's this kind of colored bar around the edges of the screen. And on one occasion, I had my computer monitor set to a weird setting, and it was covering up my clock. And when that happened, it turned out that I just had to mouse over it and it would become sort of transparent so I could see the clock. So if you just, I think they fixed it, but if you happen to run into something like that, it's a good thing to know. I believe T-Square will also have a little sort of countdown timer on it. And the actual timer includes more time than is allotted for the exam because there's additional time to allow for the scanning. We don't expect you to be finished and also scanned within 90 minutes. Brian is asking, to what extent is it okay for the students to discuss the content of the single sheet of handwritten notes allowed during the exam? I would say in advance of when the exam window opens, it's perfectly okay to discuss that as much as you like. Once the exam window is open, I would be very careful about it, because if you say something like, gee, I am sure glad I put the master theorem details on my handwritten sheet of notes, and you've already taken the exam, then that's basically telling someone what's on there. And that's sort of a not extreme, but it's still in the realm of giving someone an unfair advantage over other people who haven't been given hints by someone who already took it. Ultimately, I would say what goes on the sheet of notes is a personal thing. What you need to be reminded of is probably not exactly the same thing that someone else needs to be reminded of. And I would also remind you that the actual creation of the sheet of notes is actually probably the most important part of its existence. A lot of people will say that just going through the process of thinking about what's really important and analyzing what they know and what they don't know and what they absolutely want to be able to remind themselves of during a test ends up making them understand it well enough that they don't even need the sheet of notes quite so much. I mean, you don't want to toss it out or anything, but I think there have even been sitcoms that joked about that, where, a teenager would be getting ready to cheat on a test and sneaking notes onto the bottom of his shoe or something. And then he'd get in trouble for cheating when he really hadn't used the notes in the end because he spent so much trouble creating these notes that he actually learned the material accidentally. But the main reason you're allowed to have a sheet of notes is because creating the sheet is a really good learning experience. And remember that you don't want to write, say, so microscopically tiny that trying to read the notes will take a lot of time, because that's any time that you're spending looking through your notes and trying to figure out what they say is time you're not spending trying to answer questions. Likewise, I've said this before, but if there are mathematical symbols that you don't know well, I would personally suggest trying to memorize them ahead of time rather than try to rely on a sheet of notes to get that information. Because, well, it's really hard to read complicated math if you have to stop every 2 seconds to look up what the next symbol means. The more that you have in your head immediately accessible, the better you can do at just moving ahead and doing the work. Uh, Anytime you have to stop and look stuff up, you're breaking your flow and you're making it harder to concentrate and taking up working memory. And this is all stuff that you want to keep free for the stuff that's actually being asked and being tested. So, we assume, hopefully the audio didn't go out for very long. I didn't see your comment. We assume as we go that you know symbols like the summation symbol and the union symbol and that kind of thing. And that stuff is not really a good use of space on your exam sheet because it is memorizable and it's as distracting as anything if you're trying to look it up while you're taking a test. So if you possibly can, memorize that kind of symbology and basic terminology kind of stuff. If you're still afraid that you're going to forget it, there's nothing wrong with having it on your little cheat sheet. But do your best to not need it. But yeah, beyond that, I think it's even a good thing to discuss with each other what you're going to include and say, here's what I want to include and why. And someone else can say, well, I'm not so sure that part really needs to be there. Because if you think of it this way, then it's really easy to remember it. So I chose to use my space on this other thing. And that discussion in itself can also be a good studying opportunity. And I will remind you, if this is completely unofficial and completely not required, but there is a Slack channel for students that students maintain. And it's been linked on Piazza. I'm sure people will link it again for you. And there is a 6505 channel there where people regularly discuss the material. And even people from previous semesters hang out and discuss the material. And you're welcome to go in there and talk to each other. Huh. I am not sure what the problem is. Let me type for a sec. Yeah, I don't think, assuming that people can hear me at all, I don't think that it could possibly be an actual computer issue because I don't think that would be transient. But I am physically across the street from campus right now, so I'm not on the campus network. So it could just be that there was a slight hiccup in the apartment building internet. Campus network is much better for reference for anyone who decides to visit. Okay, so when we cut out for a second, I was just saying that there is a student Slack channel, completely unofficial, completely not required. It's not a place where we will ever exclusively release any information about the class. But I'm not going to go onto that channel and say, well, question 1 is going to be on this topic, so make sure you guys look at that. I would never do that. Whoops. I must have knocked my power cord out. One sec. That's one of those things about these recent computers with the fancy power cords that are designed to never be able to pull your computer off the table and break it. Just as soon as they design a power cord that comes out easily so that you can't break your computer, your power cord pops out easily so that you run out of power. And thank you guys for letting me know when it gets weird. So, back to topic. The Slack channel last semester seemed to be a place where people had a lot of fun talking to each other, or at least a lot of comfort commiserating about how much trouble they were having when the day wasn't going so well. So certainly feel free to go hang out there, or feel free to create your own Google Hangouts with classmates, or go hang out at a library, or go out for drinks, whatever. But the Slack channel is nice because it's just kind of always there and it's available to the whole class. So I've seen people come and go pretty much all the time. And you are free to discuss problem sets and stuff there, just like you do on Piazza, because we're not grading it. It doesn't matter to assessment. You can't possibly cheat by working on your problem sets together. We want you to learn from each other. Explaining something to someone else is a really good way of checking whether you actually understand it. Let's see. Oh, come to think of it, for Proctor Track, you must have ID. So remember to have your driver's license or something handy. And yeah, it'll take a picture of your ID. So on the off chance you somehow have some sort of ID that has something secret on it, I don't think that exists, but if it does, try to use something else. You know, driver's license is fine, state issued ID is fine, Georgia Tech ID is fine. Yes, absolutely. You can pick problems from CLRS and discuss them if you want. You can go to random websites for CMU and Stanford and University of Washington and look at what they've assigned for homework if you need extra problems. Sometimes there are problems and solutions available. MIT has the OCW project, OpenCourseWare, and they have material for a lot of classes online, including exams and homework and solutions. You're perfectly willing to go, perfectly permitted to go out and do whatever it takes to learn the material and to feel good about it. We're not trying to make your life difficult. I mean, really, the end goal is for you to understand the material, at least enough to be able to go out into the world and potentially say, oh, that thing I want to code is going to take way too long when I actually run it on the kind of data set I have. So I'm going to have to make some decisions about how I can cut down the runtime. That's the big part of this class that's really important to potential programmers. And the other reasoning stuff is really helpful when you run into something like, I mentioned cryptography earlier. If you want to understand why cryptography works, this material helps tremendously. It's not that you can't kind of understand, oh, I hit this encrypt button and then it's encrypted and no one can read it without this material. But knowing this stuff gives you a much better intuitive grip on exactly why you can trust that. And if you were ever to have to make decisions about, say, do I want to switch to elliptic curve cryptography or do I want to stick with the standard stuff? Understanding this kind of thing can give you enough of an underlying grip on the math to say, I may not be an expert, but I kind of grasp what the trade-offs are, and I think I can make this decision. So, you know, this is intended to be just enough to give you a foundation to understand other fields or to understand what kind of research is going on in the world. Any other kind of pre-exam stuff that you guys want to cover? I'll say again, please, please, please go take the practice exam. If some kind of significant error comes up, it's significantly harder to fix when it's already the weekend, and it can be difficult to get in touch with someone. And that reminds me, over exam weekend, you may want to be extra careful to only log into your Georgia Tech account through your normal computer and, not using a VPN, virtual private network, not traveling um, or anything like that. It's not common, but every so often someone, say, logs in through a work computer that's running everything through a proxy in Germany. And now it looks to the Georgia Tech machines like you've suddenly teleported 3,000 miles in the past hour. And so they figure there's some kind of security problem and they cut off access to your account. And it's Saturday, and the only people who can fix it won't be back until Monday, and then the exam will be closed. And that's a lot of stress. It's the kind of thing where you want to avoid it if you possibly can. Try to make your life a little bit easier. I know I'm full of horror stories, but this is 8 semesters now, I think I've been around. So there have been a lot of exams, not just for this class. I mean, I've taken 10 OMS courses myself, and I'm I'm in ML for trading now, but I'm technically in the on-campus section. But I've had the opportunity to see thousands of exams take place with people taking them. And so that stuff that has like a 0.5% chance of happening has had the opportunity to happen a couple of times. And I do my best to warn people because we don't want bad things to happen to anybody. Any other kind of exam related questions? It's a little hard to ask about questions because there is a definite delay between when I do something and then it makes its way to YouTube. I guess there's processing time to turn it into a stream and transmission time to get it to YouTube and transmission time to send it back, and it makes the conversation feel a little bit disjointed. Okay, unless I see anything in the next few seconds, I'm going to stop 10 minutes early so that I don't want to take up anyone's time with dead air. It's kind of boring. Um, Obviously, we will still be on Piazza for the next week. When the exam period opens, we traditionally stop answering content-related questions. The theory behind that is that we don't want it to be better for you to wait until Sunday to take the test because you think that maybe someone will share extra information from the TAs about whatever's on the exam or the class content or whatever on a Saturday. And then, whoever's taken the test on Friday had to take it without extra information that the people on Sunday didn't have, or that the people on Sunday did have, rather. So, in the interest of trying to make the test experience as equal for everyone as possible, no matter when they take their exam, we usually stop discussion from the TAs on Friday morning. But students are still allowed to discuss so long as they haven't taken the test yet. Once you've taken the test, we ask that you not discuss with anybody. So don't even come back to Piazza and sort of show a lot of interest in a topic and end up implying that it's really important to the others. It's it's difficult to provide an equal experience to everyone when the students are spread all over the world and taking the test under different conditions and that kind of thing. But we try. Okay, question is, okay, this is relation to induction, I believe. Base cases should always be the smallest n. The base case should be the smallest n that you want to prove it's true for. Let's say you're doing induction on something that's true starting with n equals 1. If I only care about if it's true when n equals 11 or larger, the inductive logic still works if I start at 11. But if I present it that way, then I haven't proven anything about, say, n equals 5. So it depends on what you care about. If you actually care about those smaller numbers, you definitely need them. And traditionally, an inductive proof will start at the smallest possible value because it's sort of like, why not? If you can prove it with the same logic for a larger range of numbers, then why not just do it? Why limit your proof without any special reason to do it? That is basically right. The theory behind induction and the logic of induction doesn't just apply to the straight numbers. Um, the logic of induction is that if I know everything is okay right now, and I can prove that this change that I want to make will not take an okay situation and make it not okay, then that new then that move is okay, and the new situation that can arise from that is all right. So say that this can happen in reasoning about games, for example. Uh, Anytime you have a valid game position and you make a valid move, the new position is guaranteed to be valid. Fundamentally, that's the same logic that induction rests on. Uh, Except induction says, okay, I know if I know something is true for n, and I know it's true, if it's true for n, it must be true for n plus 1, then I can say that if I prove this is true at n equals 1, I've proven it's true for all the bigger numbers, or all the bigger natural numbers anyway. It's I personally think the reasoning of induction kind of makes more sense if you skip the base case initially. The purpose of the base case being done first, I think, is to establish that this is true at least some of the time. Like, we know this statement is true at the very least at n equals 1. Now we'll prove that it's true some other times too. But in my head, at least, when I'm thinking about how induction works, it makes more sense to do the if it's true for n, it's true for n plus 1 part, and then establish the specific n's, some specific starting n for which I know it's true. Um, it's just personal preference about how I process that piece of information. But if it turns out to be useful for anyone, that's great. I don't recall him specifically picking out potential exam questions, but maybe I'm just blanking on it right now. Um, are you asking for like more solutions or something? Like I'm not thinking like if you pick out potential exam questions, you already have the whole problem set. Or maybe I was just really sleepy when I was watching that one and I'm not remembering what he did. Oh, okay, yeah, I think I remember that now. Uh, yeah, I honestly don't think I'm quite the person who should be doing that. Um, Part of the problem is that I've already seen the exam or the tentative exam, And if I try to pick something out and say this could be a type of problem that would be on the exam, um, I'm already biased toward the type of problem that actually is on the exam. And I don't want to hint at more than he ever intended me to hint at. Yeah, I know. Everyone's trying to break into my email account now. I'm gonna get a message from Georgia Tech that they've locked my account because someone tried to log in from Singapore or something. Yeah, I think the examples he gave should at least give you an idea of the type of questions you could see. Um, if there's a lot of intensive math with tiny details where one number could go wrong and cause the whole problem to go off the rails, that's the kind of thing we try to avoid as an exam question. Because, like I said before, we want to see how you reason about things. We don't want to have you show us that you can be a human calculator. And certainly it's worth thinking in general, like anytime you're preparing for a test for a class, it's worth thinking, how easy would this be to grade? Um, because if you run into something where it could be like, oh, that's, uh, for example, there are gaming algorithms in artificial intelligence, since I keep mentioning that. And they have like little decision trees and stuff. And a very small one could be an easy thing to draw and turn into a question that someone could look over and grade very easily. Um, if you look at a question and you think, wow, that would be a nightmare to grade, then you should probably think that we have to grade it 300 times. So we'll probably avoid that. No absolute guarantees, but it's when you're trying to weigh how you allocate your time, that's one of the things you can use to narrow down where your attention should be. Let me, I have number 2 here. Let me double check what that question says. Yeah, it says only 3 multiplications, so I don't see any reason that you couldn't do more than 3 of something else. One of one of the things about this class that can get very frustrating for students is that people will come to us and ask the question, could you do it this way? And we'll almost never say no. Um, the only time the answer to like could this be proven this way is no is if I can absolutely prove to myself that that is impossible. Uh, my typical example is that there are at least 200 different ways to prove the Pythagorean theorem. For whatever reason, people have had a great time with coming up with hundreds of ways to do this. And of course, most of those hundreds of ways aren't anything that any of us would ever be worried about, but it means that there are many, many ways to do it. And when you're talking about how to prove something or how to establish something, there are probably going to be 1,000 ways to do it that we've never thought of when we picked out the problem set or wrote it on the exam. And if you choose a way that works but that never occurred to us, then you get credit because you did it. And in some cases, in previous semesters, we've had people come up with strategies that made the answer much cleaner than what we had been thinking of doing. And so we actually hinted to other people, like, oh, go try this theorem, because someone found that and they realized that it works really well. Yeah, I mean, there are even times where you say, "Well, can I do this?" And I'm like, I probably like I have a feeling that might work, but I don't know for sure. I do my best to never lie to people. I try to give a genuine answer, and sometimes the genuine answer is I don't know, or my best intuition is that it's probably this thing, but I couldn't prove it to you. Whenever you have super, super hard math problems, the person to go to is always the professor, by the way. I'm pretty good. Obviously, I would have to be to become the head TA, but I am not a person who has a PhD in applied math. So he's a whole exponential level beyond me. But fortunately, most of the stuff in this class I understand quite well. So we should be fine. And now it's 10 o'clock. I'll give you guys a few more seconds to potentially type in a question. And if we don't have any more questions, then we'll shut down for the day. And I will wish you all a happy weekend with good weather and fruitful studying and maybe even some time with your families. Let me take a look. I thought that one was discussed on Piazza. Yeah, could you bring up that question about question one on problem set three on Piazza again after this so that I can take another look at it? Or, yeah, ping me with a private Piazza message to remind me. Because I had thought that was discussed already, but I don't want to accidentally say the wrong thing. So I want to be able to take some time to check through it. All right, thank you. Yeah, there's another office hours slated in a couple of days, I think for the 13th. So do remember that one because that will be the last one before the exam. So last chance to ask panicked questions. Oh yes, that is a thing that happens sometimes. A person was saying the response on Piazza is that question one was much harder than expected. Um, every once in a while, we work up a solution to something and we think we're right, and then we find a flaw in it later, and we realize that the question is dramatically more complicated than intended. Uh, we're always very sorry when that happens. It's not intentional. There was one case last semester where a problem turned out really dramatically harder than intended. So just at least know that we're aware that this kind of thing can happen and that when it does, it's an accident and an honest mistake. We're human too. If it were to happen on an exam question, I'm sure he'd make some kind of adjustment to account for the fact that the question was more difficult than it was intended to be when assigned. But also keep in mind that we check the exam questions more carefully. Um, Several of the TAs have been assigned to actually sit down and take the exam and write up answers so that we can see separately that, they haven't run into some kind of problem that we didn't anticipate, or that there wasn't some kind of miswording in the question that easily led someone astray. So, we're basically beta testing to try to make sure that there isn't going to be a serious problem after the exam already opens. It is possible that we could do office hours earlier sometimes. Yeah, the video being available is nice. It used to be the case that every single TA had their own office hours every single week. So there were like, I think, 10 hours of office hours a week in a typical week because a couple of us usually stayed for 2 hours. And in that case, we didn't record it, partly because we didn't want people to feel like they were required to watch 10 hours of additional video a week. That just seemed like absolute madness. But when that happened, we deliberately kind of spread them through the day to try to cover as many time zones as possible. Now that we have much fewer, we're recording instead to try to make sure that everyone has access. Um, if it turns out that the timing doesn't work that great, we can talk about occasionally having one at like 3 p.m. or something. The I think you'll find in OMS a lot of courses focus on making stuff as convenient as possible for people who are in the Eastern time zone because that's where Georgia Tech is. Um, some courses will also do daytime for Georgia just because that's when the TAs happen to be on campus, particularly for the classes where the TAs are all on campus. But it's an ongoing adjustment and experiment, I would say, for the whole program, trying to figure out how to adequately support people who are all over the world. We have not perfected it, and if anyone ever has more suggestions about how we can make it work really well, we're always listening. I was actually sort of half joking with some other people that we should be recruiting in the education technology class to try to convince someone to implement a Chrome add-on for us that lets people do the stuff that Hangouts on Air used to let you do, like ask questions in advance and vote on which question you want to see an answer to. Because this isn't horrible, like having a feed, but it would have been nicer if people could just come to YouTube and leave their question sitting here rather than have to have a separate Piazza thread, or that people could have hit +1 on a particular question to show me that 6 people were really anxious to see the answer to this. But, you know, always open to suggestions. OMS is kind of a gigantic experiment. Everyone is trying really hard. I don't think you're going to get to vote on what question should appear on the exam. Well, I guess you could vote, but the vote wouldn't count for anything. Yeah, try not to panic too much about the first exam. The class is not graded on a curve, but if we realize that we've terribly miscalculated how difficult the question should be, then we're people who can admit that we've made an error. We'll figure out how to make it all work. Okay, I think we are done for the night. I hope you're all going to have a really good weekend. And I will see you on Piazza. I don't, yeah, the next office hours isn't me, I think. I don't know, unless something changes and they tell me it's me. I'm pretty sure it's someone else. So be nice to whoever does office hours next. And take care of yourselves. Good night.